Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Amy McPhie Allebest. In 2014, a poll was conducted in Utah to see what percentage of the population supported same-sex marriage. The results indicated that 40% of Utahns supported it. 10 years later, in 2024, the same poll was conducted again, and this time 72% of Utahns supported marriage equality. How did this happen, and how did it happen so fast? To talk about this issue and other issues, I am so thrilled to welcome to the podcast Troy Williams, the head of Equality Utah. Thank you so much for being here, Troy.
Amy, it's my pleasure. I'm so excited to spend some time with you.
I'm so excited too. This is fun to have a reason to spend an hour together just chatting. But I'm really, really excited to hear more of your story too, and also the story of Equality Utah and the changes that are happening. So super excited to dig into that. But first, I'm going to read your professional bio, and you get the task of just sitting and listening to me sing your praises while you just sit there and squirm awkwardly in your chair.
Okay, all right, take it away.
And then as soon as I read that, I'll have you introduce yourself more personally afterwards. For the past 2 decades, I'm going to start that again. For the past 2 decades, Troy Williams has been a community organizer for LGBTQ Utahns. In 2003, he became the community affairs director of 90.9 FM KRCL radio station and executive producer of the talk show Radioactive. In 2010, the Salt Lake Tribune dubbed Troy the gay mayor of Salt Lake City. That's pretty awesome, and that is a title I did not know you had, Troy. That's incredible.
I did not run for that office, I will confess.
That's amazing. I want a plaque somewhere on the door. In 2010, Troy co-wrote the award-winning play The Passion of Sister Dottie S. Dixon with the late Charles Lynn Frost. In 2011, Troy appeared in the scandalous Errol Morris true crime Mormon noir film Tabloid, which detailed the alleged kidnapping of an LDS missionary by a Wyoming beauty queen. This is the best bio I think I've ever read, Troy. Holy cow. You've done...
It's not over yet.
Amazing things. In 2013, Troy produced the TLC original series Breaking the Faith, which followed the lives of FLDS youth on the run. And in 2022, Troy was a consultant on the FX series Under the Banner of Heaven with Andrew Garfield and director Dustin Lance Black. Troy has also appeared in the HBO original films Believer and Mama's Boy. In 2022, The Advocate magazine named Troy one of the nation's 50 LGBTQ champions of pride. Troy became the executive director of Equality Utah in the fall of 2014, and in 2015, he helped pass Utah's historic Utah Compromise, which successfully balanced LGBTQ non-discrimination protections with religious liberty. In 2016, he led efforts to rename 20 blocks of downtown Salt Lake City as Harvey Milk Boulevard. I was just there yesterday and noticed again, Troy, and was just so moved by that. So awesome to see that signage. In 2019, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, go ahead.
In 2019, he worked to pass an LGBTQ and racially inclusive hate crime statute. In 2023, his team successfully passed legislation unanimously through the Utah legislature to codify a ban on LGBTQ conversion therapy for minors. I mean, it's amazing, Troy. You've done some fun and crazy, interesting things, and then so much incredible social justice work. And I'm just super honored to know you and really excited to have you talk about this kind of more in depth on the podcast today.
Absolutely.
First, I'd love you to tell us your story, kind of where you grew up, your background, your education, and just some of the things that were formative in making you who you are today.
Yeah, thanks. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, and I grew up in an LDS family in a very liberal town. And I had 2 friends in high school. 2 of my best friends were LDS, and they went a different path than me. They actually were encouraged to go into conversion therapy, and it had very destructive impact on their lives, and very painful for me to watch them go through that. And it really pushed me deeper into the closets as a teenager, because I was very afraid of what it might mean about me and myself. So I stuffed that down pretty deeply while I was, listening to my Erasure and Depeche Mode and Yaz albums as a teenager in the '80s, and um, and then sublimated all of that by going on an LDS mission for 2 years to England. And then when I came back, this nascent thing was still within me, and it was getting stronger, and I was having, you're in your early 20s, and you have your hormones are surging, and so I was so afraid that was gay, that I thought if I moved to Utah, everything would get better, and so I sublimated it even further by joining the Utah Eagle Forum. Now, you have to know the Utah Eagle Forum is this arch conservative organization founded by Phyllis Schlafly. And Phyllis had mentored and trained the president of the Eagle Forum, Gail Ruzicka, who then became my mentor. And the first time that I ever went to the Utah Capitol was actually with Gail, and she trained me in her ways. And in the early '90s, I mean, she was at the height of her power. The gallery in the Senate and in the House that was her area, and she could look down upon lawmakers and with a thumbs up or a thumbs down, command them in the vote. And so I was kind of caught up in that. And it was a way I thought, that if I just became like this turbo righteous Latter-day Saint, that the goodness and the holiness of my righteous cause would straighten me out. But it didn't. And, I had to go on this journey of self-discovery that's familiar to a lot of LGBT people. And ultimately, I left Eagle Forum and left the LDS Church and went on a journey of self-discovery. And actually then moved to the other side of the political spectrum and became kind of a rabble-rouser activist. When I was working at KRCL Radio, I would be the kid that was out there organizing the protests and the rallies and the marches and the sit-ins and kiss-ins, and famously was arrested at the Capitol at a protest. And yeah, so I moved from one extreme to the other, really trying to just kind of discover what advocacy was, what activism was, but no one really trains you how to do it. So you just kind of like, mentors, but you kind of like sort of learn as you do. And then that kind of ultimately led me to Equality Utah down the road.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I want to dig in on a couple of things. First of all, can I ask, is it okay if I ask when you were kind of younger and feeling like, you were feeling those beginnings of like your sexuality waking up and going like, oh, okay, this is giving me different information than what I expected. Maybe what, did you ever consider talking to your family about it? And like, where were the messages coming from? Aside from your friends going to conversion therapy, which understandably would have scared you, like where were the messages coming from that made you think like, that's not safe for me to be that?
Well, I was a teenager in the '80s, as the AIDS epidemic was just hitting and devastating gay men, and just it generated a lot of fear, because the popular rhetoric of that time was that this was God's curse for the sin of Sodom, and that this was just a natural result of this wickedness. And so I believed as a young Latter-day Saint that I wasn't actually gay, but I was actually so righteous that Satan was trying to tempt me. Um,
Ah,
and so Satan would put these homosexual feelings within me, which is really, I had to do a lot of work, therapy, etc., as an adult to unpack that, because how devious and sinister is that to believe that that impulse that beautiful impulse from your heart to connect to another heart, that impulse to love and touch and connect and kiss and hold another human being, which is so innate to who we are as humans, is actually motivated by the devil. And it's just not true. But as a teenager, I couldn't unpack that. I couldn't
Yeah.
understand that. And so I just stuffed it down, deep down, 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 and thought by being super righteous, and that would sort of lead me, that those feelings would go away over time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the messages came from church. They came from sort of popular society. They came from my parents. I famously remember, and I tell this story, um, not to make my sister feel bad, because we've worked through this subsequently throughout the years. But in LDS culture, one of the former presidents of the church is a man named Spencer W. Kimball, who was a prophet for the Mormon Church when I was a young teen. And he had famously or infamously written a book called Miracle of Forgiveness. And in this book, and I remember my sister handing it to me when I was a young teenager. And in this book, President Kimball makes this astounding and heinous inference. It's this, on one page, he says that masturbation will lead to the gross sin of homosexuality. And then you get to the next page, and homosexuality will lead to the even grosser sin of bestiality, which was difficult for me as a young kid because I grew up on a farm. And
Oh,
so so there was like this, I was on this little rural area outside of Eugene. And so I was around farm animals. And so my brain was all like, what is going on? And how can this impulse to love somebody lead me down to such a dark path with sheep? And so And thankfully, I've never been attracted to animals. But that's the kind of stuff that gets in your head as a little
yeah,
kid. Like if you follow this impulse, and of course, back in the '80s, there wasn't that like there wasn't a lot of good sort of gay
yeah.
representation in media. I remember, I think that the first gay character I knew was Stephen Carrington on Dynasty, and I think it was the season one finale where Blake walks in on Stephen with his young lover, and they fight, and then Steve or Blake throws the lover down the stairs and kills him. So these
Gosh.
images of what it means to be gay, to be gay was death, right? It was spiritual death, to be cut off from the presence of God, from your family eternally. It was physical death, either you'd be attacked or murdered, or you'd catch a disease that would kill you.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was really a fearful time, even though I simultaneously, as I said, I was obsessed with Erasure and the Communards and Bronski Beat and all of these queer artists that really resonated with my soul. Like I just connected with them and loved them. And my closest friends, as a kid, as a child, and as a teenager, all would turn out to be gay.
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
Interestingly enough.
yeah.
One of my best friends as a teenager, Kevin, was not Mormon, and I went on we parted ways when we were 18 or 19, and I went on my mission to England, and he went on a world tour with Madonna as a dancer in the Blonde Ambition tour. And so we've come back together since then, and are dear friends today.
Wow.
And just actually, we were together at the Madonna Celebration concert in Palm Springs, which was fun.
Oh,
So
amazing.
yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
that's so
So
cool.
so I was always adjacent to queerness, and it was always attractive to me. It was innate within me,
Hmm.
and I'm very grateful, for all of that. So
Yeah.
because ultimately it was that pop culture element, those dear friends, that ultimately pulled me out of the Utah Eagle Forum, and that little detour in my life.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask on that, like, kind of those double tracks, because you were really involved politically with the Eagle Forum. I had totally forgotten that it was literally the Eagle Forum. It's crazy. But then also personally, I was going to ask you, like, what helped you change your path toward being able, before we get to the political side, which will be
Mhm.
next, but
Yeah.
personally for you, where you were able to start to kind of rehabilitate from the harm that had been done, and been
Yeah.
able to like reteach your brain like that this isn't from the devil, and actually there's nothing wrong with this. Is there like one or two influences or factors that helped you on that journey?
Yeah, I mean, there were several influences. Unconditional friends, friends who kind of love and support you on the journey. And, I had several friends sit me down, because often your friends know before you do. Bullies know that you're gay before you do, and your close friends do. Your parents are sometimes last to know, um,
Hmm.
but yeah. So I just had dear friends that loved me unconditionally, and I knew that I could be out and gay, and that I wouldn't lose them.
Hmm.
And when I had that anchor, I got courageous. I also had to go on a big journey to kind of deconstruct my religious upbringing and spend a lot of time reading Mormon history and really asking a lot of difficult questions because I needed to know really what I believed. And what I thought was true or not true, and because it's a high stakes faith, and so to leave it, means also to leave your family to some degree, right? So there is a huge risk in walking away from something. And so I just had to know. I just had to know. And when I got to the point, and I did have good therapists, and I can't, I think, therapists in conjunction with psychedelics can be very helpful in working through some of those difficult things. But I had some deep spiritual experiences, and then I had a really beautiful experience driving down the street in Provo one day, and I had a CD in my car, and it was an Indigo Girls CD, and I was listening to their music, and I was listening to the harmonies and their voice and the words of their songs, and it was so beautiful. And I had this realization while listening that God, whatever that force is that we call God, like loved the Indigo Girls and was like a fan. And I had like this kind of realization that nobody that could create such beauty could be despised of God. And it hit me so hard. I still get chills thinking about it. It hit me so hard that I had to pull over on University Avenue in Provo. I had to pull over and just sit there. And I realized in that moment, God loves gay people. God has gay people on the planet to create and to create beauty and art and music and joy. And it was the first time I kind of realized that. And I just had to sit there and feel that in my bones that God loved gay people. And then I could, you know, I could accept that within myself.
Yeah.
And I remember driving. It wasn't this all. It didn't all come all that moment. I came out. I sort of opened the window and screamed to the world, "I'm gay!" But I like all of Provo heard. No, that wasn't what happened. But that opened the door. And then I remember later, just a few days later, like driving over the point of the mountain on I-15. And I remember like practicing saying it out loud. I'm yeah. And then the next time I got a little bit bolder. I'm yeah. And then I finally said, I'm gay. And I like yelled it right at the top of my lungs in the car by myself. And it was just this beautiful moment of self-discovery. And I felt this freedom to be me. and and it was yeah, that was my that's my coming out story. And then I
Ah,
slowly started telling my friends, and then yeah. So but
beautiful. Oh,
yeah.
thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so did that correspond pretty much on your timeline with like, okay, if this is true about me, then that is going to impact how I view the world politically also, and like the kind of causes that I want to be involved in. Clearly you had a mind for, you wanted to help change the world,
Yeah.
and then it was a pretty hard pivot in a different direction. So did that correlate with that time period?
It sure did. I had this like gap with college where I was in such disarray. I went to BYU for one semester, and my belief system was collapsing, and I knew I couldn't stay there. So I just went and worked, and then I went back to college. And then in college, it's when you explore a lot of things and do your first psychedelics and and all of those kinds of things. And but for me, it wasn't. I came out when I was in college, and it was really when 2000. It was actually 9/11, 2001, and I remember that day so like vividly, where two planes had struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and I didn't know why. I didn't understand the kind of geopolitics that would lead someone to do such a heinous act. And I felt that I'd really been kind of sort of self-absorbed trying to figure out this gay thing and this religion thing, that I hadn't actually peered out externally to the broader world around me. It's very easy when you live in Utah and you're part of this faith just to be absorbed by it. And
Mm-hmm.
I was like, wow, I don't understand the world outside my window. And but I didn't believe that going and bombing, Iraq was the right response, and I just didn't like that. And so I went to my first anti-war protest, and started really just kind of started getting involved in volunteering. And then I think 2003, I'm volunteering at KRCL Radio, and we had just launched a new talk show called Radioactive. And I just jumped in on the ground floor with it, helped build it up, and started producing it just as a volunteer for the couple months. And then within 2 months of the show launching, I was like the producer of the show. And then I worked there for 10 years. And that was really just a great place to really be mentored by some of the best thinkers for advocacy in Utah and also nationally and globally. And then I started, getting really audacious. In 2004, the Utah legislature passed Amendment 3, which amended the state constitution to forbid any form of relationship recognition that was same sex or gay or civil unions, etc. Gay marriage was already illegal, but any contractual arrangement between gay couples, would not be recognized by the state. And that passed by referendum.
Oh.
And it was in response to Massachusetts being the first
Oh.
state 20 years ago now, the first state to pass marriage equality. So
Mm-hmm.
all the conservative states they kind of panicked, and so started passing these marriage bans.
Mm-hmm.
And Utah was one of them. And it was really shocking to me to see, like over 60% of the state supported, the ban into the state constitution. And that was kind of heartbreaking to see. And that lit a fire under me to be an activist myself. And so at that point, then I started organizing rallies and protests and marches, etc. So, and just practiced, what it was like to get a bullhorn and get in front of a crowd, in front of a microphone, and sort of, work the crowd. And it was a really incredibly exciting time,
Mm-hmm.
back then. But
Yeah. Okay, so tell us more about Radical Troy. Like, I mean,
yeah.
this phase and that kind of what was in your head, like how you were seeing the world, and the like your belief system and what was going to be most effective in bringing about the change that you wanted to see.
Yeah, I like to refer to this as the militant homosexual era.
Okay.
And that was actually Gail Ruzicka, my old mentor. I remember she sent this action alert out to her Eagle Forum list, and referring to me as a militant homosexual.
Oh
And I
wow.
thought that was the greatest compliment. That was like I wanted the T-shirt, a militant homosexual. So I started building this kind of brand around being kind of bombastic and, being a sort of rabble rouser. And there was a lot of theatrics to that, but I believe that I wanted to sort of jolt people out of their complacency. And so I thought having a more in your face kind of approach would be good. And I'd read a lot of LGBT history, and so I knew the impact of like ACT UP and how important ACT UP was in Queer Nation. And they were these radical rabble rousers who would do die-ins and who would do, all kinds of like dramatic stunts to really draw attention to the urgency of what they were working on. And so I felt a lot of affinity for that kind of the kind of punk rock ethos
Mhm.
of kind of tear it down and defy authority, and just to be a sort of iconoclastic in my approach. And so I did, and I was, I think I scared a lot of the kind of establishment gay people a little bit, and there was a time when I was always very committed to like peaceful, like nonviolent protests. So I always
Mhm.
was like, thinking about Gandhi and Dr. King, and I never wanted to like do anything I never wanted to destroy property or instigate any form of violence.
Mhm.
But I wanted to be creative and clever and provoke conversation. So I think the first activist thing I ever did, there was this state senator named Chris Butters, and he was this cranky old senator, and he would say heinous things, and he would he would pass out literature on the Senate floor talking about how gays and gay pig sex and all these graphic, pornographic, disgusting fetish things that had nothing to do with gay culture, but really it was about sort of fetish culture.
Mhm.
And then he got up famously and he said, the gays were worse than Muslim terrorists, and was lampooned on late night shows because he said, "I don't mind the gays, but they keep shoving it down my throat." And and so my first activist stunt I ever did was a thing called a Butters Palooza, and we threw this big party at the Capitol. And I made it very clear I wanted it to be a party. And we brought like a blues band and DJs and break dancers and drag queens, and we threw this big party up at the Capitol to celebrate Chris Butters uniting all of the progressives in Utah. And we had union organizers speaking and climate justice folks speaking and queer people speaking. And it was just this very kind of sort of full spectrum social justice is kind of like how I think about it. But it was fun and it was joyful, and that kind of caught on a lot of attention, and that kind of began to shape my advocacy. I was militant, I was in your face, I was angry, but I was also fun. I
Mhm.
also wanted to have fun because I always thought about the great anarchist Emma Goldman, and she famously said, "If you don't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." And I loved that because I always wanted people to feel like they had a place at the protest, at the party, at the
Mhm.
celebration, and that if we danced and centered joy, and alongside of our outrage, right,
Mhm.
that you needed both.
Mhm.
You had to have both. That if joy and outrage could coexist, the more people would come along with us.
Hmm.
And so that kind of became my style of advocacy.
Okay. And so did it evolve from there? I kind of think that some things probably have stayed the same, and you stayed true to like definitely some core values and even
Yeah.
some tactics, it sounds like, but I think some of your tactics have changed.
Oh,
How and
sure.
how
Yeah.
and why?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had an experience in 2012 that was really life changing for me. So if you are familiar with Dustin Lance Black, he's a gay Mormon filmmaker. He won the Oscar for the screenplay to the Harvey Milk film. Lance and I also worked together on Under the Banner of Heaven. He's a close friend of mine, and he was the Grand Marshal for our Pride Parade in 2012. And he has a in the context of this moment, 2008,
Mhm.
uh, Proposition 8 had passed in California. The LDS Church was a major funder and organizer for this. So the tensions between the LGBT and LDS communities were at an all-time high. And protests at the temple, we did kiss-ins on Temple Square and all kinds of just sort of direct action pieces. And so there was a lot of tension. And this group of Latter day Saints called me up and wanted to meet with me. And I agreed to it and went to the old Pride Center. And it was Erica Munson and, and Kendall. And they had formed this group called Mormons Building Bridges.
Mhm.
And they said to me that they said, "Troy, we're going to march in the Pride Parade. We're number 84 in the parade route. And we're going to wear our church clothes and we're going to sing hymns all the way down the gay pride parade route." And I just looked at them and I said, either of you ever been to a gay pride parade before? And they looked at me and they're like, well, no. And I was like, I'm like, this is not the days of 47. This is the gays of 47. It's a very different experience. And uh, and I was worried. I appreciated the gesture, but I thought initially it was a bad idea because I didn't want. I had visions of tomatoes being thrown at them, and I didn't want that. And so I was worried about how they'd be received, and Lance Black came and we were talking about what do we do? We have these Mormons in the back of the parade. What do we do? And he's like, well, why don't we just bring them to the front of the parade with us, and we'll march together, kind of like an echo of the civil rights movement. Like the great
Wow.
symbol is the civil rights movement was the black hand grasping the white hand, and that they're
Yep.
together in solidarity. Why don't we follow that spirit? And the gays will march with the Mormons. And it was a big risky move, but it felt like the right move. And so on that beautiful June morning with the beautiful blue skies, over 300 active Latter-day Saints showed up at the Pride Parade in their white shirts and their floral dresses and their scriptures with these colorful signs that said LDS Hearts LGBT. One sign said, sorry, we're late.
Mhm.
And we started to march down the parade route, tens of thousands of people in the crowd watching, and they just start to cheer for them. And they cheer them. And every step, every block we went, the crowds got bigger and the cheers got bigger. And I was crying, and Lance was crying, and all the Mormons were crying. And people would run out from the crowd and they would hug people marching. Because you think about these culture war debates, they divide and break families. So many families who are religious have LGBT family members. And so these political things cause rifts and wedges between family members. And so to have this moment, to me, it was transformative, and it opened my heart in this big way. And I'm like, this is how we do. We do it with love. And we welcome people to the party, and we welcome people to the march, and we sit with people who we think are our enemies, and we march with them as allies. And that to me was that day transformed my entire approach to advocacy.
Hmm. Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so what'd you do then? And then I'm trying to remember on the timeline when you joined Equality Utah, because I feel like that's really kind of a hallmark of the work and the strategy that you've used at Equality Utah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the great thing of when you have a talk show on radio, I could say whatever I wanted to say on talk radio,
Mhm.
right? But
Yeah.
it was different to actually like implement it into actual policy and practice. And I so my predecessor at Quality Utah was Brandy Balkin, and Brandy was a dear friend of mine, and she took a job out of state, and so the position came open. And I had just been arrested at the Capitol at this big protest, and so I think the board of directors was like, "Gosh, this Troy has a reputation for being kind of a bomb thrower and a rabble rouser, and should we put him in charge of our organization that's about
Mhm.
finding common ground?" And so I had to ask myself that question too. Can I put on a suit and tie again? What I call my lobby drag, and can I go up to the Capitol? And for those of you who don't live in Utah, like the Utah legislature is at any given year 85% Republican and usually about 90% Latter-day Saints.
Mhm.
And so, how on earth would I go up to the Capitol and encourage lawmakers to pass legislation that would sort of bring rights and liberties and dignity to LGBT Utahns? How do we persuade people to rethink their position and consider another way of approaching this? And so it was a big leap for me, and I think a big leap for Equality Utah. And I took the position. They gave it to me, and and pretty quickly, I was thrown into the fire because I was hired in. So it was September of 2014. by January of 2015, I would be in very high stakes negotiation with the LDS Church and Republican leadership on what was called the Utah Compromise, which was a historic piece of legislation to provide employment and housing protections for our community.
Mhm.
And so, and I had a lot of pain in my body and my heart with the LDS Church, with the rifts that these ideas had caused in my own family. And I haven't talked much, but I was, was not estranged from my parents, but I wasn't close to my parents because of these issues. And so to find myself, literally with the patriarchy in negotiations and wanting to do something that was meaningful, that would move us forward, that would help heal some of the divisions, and being so desperately afraid of failing. Afraid of failing my family, afraid of failing my community, afraid of just the organization, and falling on my face. And I'm very proud of what we did. It was, to me, a sort of culmination of a lot of what things that had prepared me for that moment. But
Amazing. How did
yeah,
you, what the feeling that I get when I imagine that, like I describe this as a woman going into situations like this where it's like a room full of men, or a situation where I know that I'm being viewed on, in a lower peg on the totem pole and a lower place in the hierarchy.
yeah,
And like the work that I have to do to fight to say, like, I know you see me as less than you, and I do have less power structurally. Like, I do have less power structurally, but I'm approaching you with the energy of like, I know I'm your equal. Did you have to do work? Did it feel that way to you? Like, I feel
yeah,
like Queen Esther coming into like the king, and he raises the scepter, you live, and he lowers it and you die. And you're like,
right,
how do you steel
yeah,
yourself for that?
yeah. I remember. I it was all the emotions were up and all the fears were up, and I remember I would have to like think to myself, don't see them as your enemy, see them as your future ally.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I would mentally, tell myself that. And I remember like having one of my first meetings with the church. It was very tense, and it was one of those meetings where we were starting to talk through things, but then they started digging in on the issue, and then I started digging in on the issue, and my attorney started digging in, and you could feel the room getting more tense and more, like, oh, okay, uh oh, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? And I had this kind of my board chair at the time was Professor Cliff Roski. He's a constitutional law professor at the University of Utah, and he's also kind of a Buddhist too. And so he would kind of coach me through it. He's like, stay in the conflict. When you
Mm.
hit these moments where you want to turn away from each other, when you want to shut the door, when you want to walk out, that is the moment where you have to stay engaged and you have to lean into it and stay with it and stay through it until a path opens up. And so he would coach me through that, and that's what we would do. And believe me, these were not like easy conversations; they were hard. And there were several times when I thought, "Oh, this is all going to fall apart. There's no way that this is going to come together." But followed by Cliff's voice in my ear: "Stay in the conflicts. Stay engaged. Don't shrink back from it." You know. And then I think there's also a lot of I think that for me it was a lot of like, well, can I trust these men? And I
Mm.
think that they felt the exact same way, right? Can I trust this gay apostate, right? This is a
Mm.
man who knew the truth. He was born under the covenant, and he's rejected it. And can we trust him? And so it truly was a leap of faith to try to figure out how we can pass a piece of legislation that would protect gay and transgender Utahns from being evicted from their homes or fired from their jobs just because they were their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And can we also, respect religious liberty along the way? Can we
Mm.
balance those two things? And I got criticism from all sides. The church was getting criticism, like, why on earth are you talking with Equality Utah? And the conservative religions were attacking them. I got, Cato Institute would go after them. Other folks did.
Mm.
I was getting attacked by the left. Don't sit down with the enemy.
Yep.
You're going to betray our people. And so it was this really, fraught moment. But the one thing that my dad and I had in common, the one thing that we bonded on, and maybe the only thing that we ever bonded on, was Star Trek. And there was, if remember the Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country, and it's this the premise is that there's this historic coming together of the Klingon Empire and the Federation, and because the war has to stop and they have to sort of kind of come together. It's sort of an allegory for perestroika and glasnost and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And there was this conflict between the Klingons and the Federation coming together and sitting down around the table to negotiate peace. And there were people on both sides working to sabotage the peace.
Yep.
And I thought about that a lot. I'm like, I'm not saying who the Klingons were in that scenario, but I just thought about how difficult it is to create peace with people who have been cast as each other's enemies.
Yep.
And people are suspicious of it. And sometimes people don't want it, right? Because they want their wounds and their hurts. And so to me, it was just essential to be in that space and to really work to make sure that there were lines that I wouldn't cross, and I articulated those very closely to the church and to other state leaders, and we stayed true to that. Mm-hmm. And I think at the end of the day, we created a bill that I'm very proud of, and that has really broad public support. Mm-hmm. 10 years later, just flash forward, just a couple months ago, there's an organization called Public Religion Research Institute, and they track social attitudes across the country. Where is the country? How do they feel about gun issues or abortion, immigration, LGBT, etc.? And they've been tracking data on the Utah Compromise and on non-discrimination laws across the country, excuse me. And what they found in 2019 is that Utah had the second highest level percentage of support for public non-discrimination laws for LGBT people. 77% of the state. That actually was second highest in the nation.
It's crazy.
And I thought that was odd. And I thought, that might be an outlier for the year. But then, by 2020, that number had risen to 80%. Mm-hmm. And then just this year or last year, so a couple months ago, they released the new data, and 86% of the state of Utah supports the Utah Compromise, supports that non-discrimination law that we made 10 years ago. So I do see public sentiment, moving and shifting toward us. And to me, it was that respectful manner with which we engaged. We did it in a way that wasn't a winner-takes-all kind of approach, that we respected religious liberty alongside, together with LGBT non-discrimination protections. And I think that created a lot of goodwill that allowed us to subsequently pass several more pro-LGBT bills in the Utah legislature.
Yeah. Well, that was my next question. So that was perfect. I was going to return to kind of what I opened with in the episode, which was this massive shift, specifically on the topic of same-sex marriage, right? Within 10 years. And the numbers just astound me because of what I guess my presupposed notions of what Utah is going to be.
Right.
It kind of has proven it wrong. So I was going to ask you that, on that specific issue of same-sex marriage or the prohibition of conversion therapy and stuff like that. I'm just assuming that it was this same approach that allowed you to make those changes as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So after the non-discrimination law was passed in 2015, 2 years later, Gail Ruzicka in 1997 had passed the Don't Say Gay law, which was a prohibition of in public school curriculum preventing teachers from talking about gay issues in the classroom.
Okay, that's going to come as a surprise to some listeners, think of this as being a new thing and it's just in Florida, right?
Oh, no. Gail was the early adopter back in the 90s on it. But flash forward 20 years into 2017, and we repealed that in the Utah legislature almost unanimously. There was only one dissenting voice in the House and one dissenting voice in the Senate. So almost unanimously, repealed that law while Gail watched it happen. It was pretty amazing experience. And then flash forward to 2020, we passed an LGBTQ inclusive hate crimes law. People have been trying to get this done in the state for 20 years, and we finally, pulled it together. Many people made that happen, and I was proud to be part of that. And then 2023, just last year, the Utah legislature, as you said, unanimously voted to ban conversion therapy. And it was all of us sitting down around the table, having really hard conversations. There were many moments when I thought I was going to fall apart, but then again, the voice of Professor Roski in my ear saying, don't disengage, stay present, be in this moment, work through the conflict. And sometimes you'll have two sides that are stuck. And if you stay engaged, a third path starts to open up inevitably, and then that you can both agree on. And what you couldn't see the possibility beforehand, but then it opens up, and then you move through it, and you bring people along with you. And so, it was one of the proudest moments of my life, when I thought back to my friends who had gone through conversion therapy, and, I was, to be able to actually ban this practice in Utah was very important to me. And even more important than the state law to me was the LDS Church actually changing direction on this issue. And in their bishop's handbook, they actually have a prohibition about bishops globally sending their members to conversion therapy now. Yeah. And so, these issues they're slow going, and sometimes the rate of change is frustrating to many people, but progress is happening. And I think we have to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that the work that still needs to happen, but also we need to recognize the victories when they come along.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Okay. Can you tell us, kind of like zoom in maybe on a moment or two to I know we've talked about kind of like your broad approach of refusing to see people as enemies and to approach with love and good faith, and seeing okay, why I can understand why this person thinks the way that they do maybe, and just seeing people in their full humanity. So those are kind of like the overarching themes and ethos of it. Take us into a moment or a specific strategy. I'm wondering if there are things that you did maybe to build empathy, or to actually open their mind to maybe create a willingness to find a third path with you. Because I can hear from your side why you were willing to come to the table, but what did you do to get these people to be willing to do that with you?
That's such a great question, and it's to me it is so essential that we don't label our opponents as bigots, haters, homophobes, TERFs, whatever thing that we can come up with, because then we lock them into an identity that may or may not be true and doesn't really allow them to evolve and grow. And so I think a lot about, in our team at Equality Utah, we think a lot about how we deactivate the amygdala when we're in conflict with people, because if we come in hard, people go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? And so often that's what, and so do we, right? We get the adrenaline starts surging, and we want to go into combat mode, or we just don't know what to say, and so we work a lot to talk about how do you deactivate that so that people can actually let their defenses drop, and then you can talk. And how that starts is with you. I've got my amygdala needs to take a back seat. My defenses have to drop. And you do that through curiosity. Eddie Izzard was a friend of mine. She's that international transgender comedian, and she was performing at our gala a couple of years ago. And she goes, we have to be brave and curious and not fearful or suspicious. We have to be brave and curious, not fearful or suspicious. And that was an earworm in my ear. I heard that over. I took her voice up to the Capitol with me all the time, and so I started asking myself, how can I be brave and curious with lawmakers? And part of it was, and so I called. So just quick backstory. We had banned conversion therapy in 2020, but we did it. We kind of sidestepped the legislature and did it through the Therapist Guild here. And there were some lawmakers that were upset about that because they had the rulemaking, governance, and we had sidestepped that. And they were angry with me. And so some lawmakers had introduced a bill to strike down that administrative rule with the Therapists Guild that would have effectively re-legalized conversion therapy in 2023. And I was devastated, like, oh my gosh, this was something that I thought that I had done something clever and sort of worked around them, but it was really a tactical mistake on my part. And so these lawmakers were kind of preparing, to strike back. And then Eddie Izzard was in my ear and kept saying to me, be brave and curious, not fearful or suspicious. Because my go-to impulse was to say, why are you such homophobic bigots? Why do you want to kill gay kids? That was my impulse in my brain. But I knew that if I would have said that, their defenses would have gone up. Mm-hmm. And I had a meeting with one of the lawmakers. It didn't go well. The first time we met, it didn't go well. And I raised my voice and I kind of walked out of it. And I failed. I kind of failed that interaction. This is not, I'm not like a master of this. I screw up and I, make mistakes. But I failed in my first attempt. And I just walked away. I'm like, oh, I just screwed this up. And so I called them back up a little bit later. I said, can I come talk to you without our attorneys, without your attorneys, without my attorneys? Can I just talk to you? And so I went in and met with this Representative Mike Peterson, and we just started talking. And I started asking him about his family and his background. And when I got curious about him, he started getting curious about me. And so I started, and then after getting to know him, then I could say, tell me about your concerns over the conversion therapy issue. And he said, well, Troy, he goes, I don't think conversion therapy works, but I've got a lot of therapists who don't know what the line is. They don't know what the rules are because it's vague. And so people don't know what they can say. We need some guidelines. And I'm like, oh, well, we can come up with guidelines. We've got good therapists, we've got all the good people. We can all come together. We can work on guidelines together. And so he's like, okay, well, let's do it. And we had help. We had like Governor Cox, and we had other people saying, hey, get everyone together, really rallying us, to come together on this issue. And so we sat down together, created some guidelines that were fair, and created a robust ban on conversion therapy for minors. And then, but it required that I had to let my defenses go. And I had to see the humanity of my opponent. My first impulse was to see him as a homophobic bigot. Yep. I was wrong. I needed to see his humanity, and then he could see mine. Mm-hmm. And now, we have become friends. I have this, this friendly banter. We don't agree on probably hardly anything politically, but we agree that we like each other, and that we want to keep that healthy relationship going. And maybe there's opportunities in the future to do even more, good, work together on legislation. So yeah, that was a really beautiful moment in the gold room of the Capitol, bringing conservatives and liberals together, signing this legislation, and for the friends of mine and for the people that I know who have gone through conversion therapy and have deep wounds and deep pain, we've done something to prevent the next generation from experiencing the same. So I'm grateful for that.
Amazing. Okay, what would you say to someone who would argue with your approach by saying how unfair it is that you, as the person, again, kind of like approaching the person in power, the people in power, that you who have been so wronged historically are the one who has to do all of the work, the emotional and psychological work, to be like, okay, I will be humble, I will be curious, and I won't be judgmental, and I will work on myself in order to approach you to make peace. And I know like people who work in racial justice and gender justice and class justice all across the board, right, will say, will make that argument and say like that's not fair.
Yeah.
And it's not, right? It's not fair. So how do you respond to that?
Oh, life ain't fair, but for whatever reason, I signed up for this work, and it certainly is not for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it does take a certain temperament.
Yeah.
And not everyone, and I don't recommend that everyone, do what I do. There's some people that just, emotionally, can't carry that burden at a certain point in their life. I certainly couldn't have carried this burden 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of had prepared myself, like I said, through lots of therapy, a few psychedelics, a few things to prepare myself spiritually and mentally and emotionally, so that I could do this work. And to me, it's a conscious act of healing. It's a way to heal my family. It's a way to heal my community. It's a way to heal, hopefully, the state and the country. And I just feel called to it. That's something that's part of my Mormon upbringing. We grow up believing that we are here for a purpose, and that we actually have a calling to a thing we have to fulfill in life. And I feel that still, and I want to be an agent of peace and an agent of change. And so I have taken on this burden, and it is not easy, and it is often painful. And there are moments when I break down and I cry and I am furious and full of rage. And I've got some close friends that allow me to call and be completely inappropriate with what I say. And I can bitch and yell and be politically incorrect. I can say whatever I want to say. So get it out of me, and then I can go back and have conversations with lawmakers, with the governor, with the media, you know. And there are times, like I said, I have lost it. I haven't been perfect at this work at all. I have screwed up and messed up, and some people have shown me grace and have given me a second shot when I maybe haven't deserved it. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Well, it won't come as a surprise to listeners that this is that you and I are extremely aligned, and you and I both know this about each other too, because we've talked about it personally. But I mean, this is the great guiding ethos of the civil rights movement too, and not just the big, the moral structure behind it, but the specific training that they would go through. Right? This is that you're describing, civil disobedience, but you're describing the great, the project of love that Dr. Martin Luther King espoused and made historic changes that way too. And it's just something that I think could actually really be the only thing that could heal our country right now, and the way the whole world, I think, is going. And it just moves me to tears to hear you talk. And I wish that there were some way to do trainings like this for people on a
Yeah.
really large scale, because I think this is what's missing in our discourse on all the levels, like in our families, in our friendships, in the legislature,
Yeah.
on social media. I think that approach is what is missing, and I'm worried for the direction it's taking us, honestly.
1,000%. Me too. And I sought out a mentor, a woman named Irshad Manji, and she wrote this really great book called "Don't Label Me." And she has what she calls her Moral Courage Project, and it's really about how to have conversations across ideological divides, but to do it in a constructive manner. And she's taught me so much. But we actually, a lot of my staff have kind of gone through her training program, and so, for example, last year, Equality Utah, we decided to get a booth at the Republican State Convention, and Ron DeSantis was the keynote speaker, and rather bombastic and inflammatory towards LGBT issues. So we thought, well, we're going to get a booth. We're not going to protest outside. We're going to be inside talking to delegates. And we worked with Earshad on this, and we did that kind of civil rights training where and we role played as a staff. Earshad would yell at us. She would call us, why are you grooming children? Why are you pedophiles? And just yell at us. And we had to practice teaching our emotions, how to deactivate the amygdala, and to respond with curiosity. You just tell me more about that. And so I know, and I have a staff member who's, a beautiful transgender veteran of the Air Force, Latina immigrant. And I was like, "Oh, Olivia, I don't want you to go to the convention. I don't think you'll be safe." And she's like, "Troy, I served in the Air Force for 2 years or 20 years, and I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. I can handle some MAGA delegates." And so we all went, and we bought these big coolers of Diet Coke because Mormons love Diet Coke. And we started handing out Diet Cokes and having conversations. We were packed the entire time, having intense conversations, and we just asked questions, and people coming in hot, by just being curious about where they're coming from. Tell me why you feel that way. Help me understand that. And then in the dialogue, find some glimmer of common ground, some gem statement that you can grab onto and say, "Oh yeah, I feel the same way," or "I understand where you're coming from with that." And then it was miraculous to watch people coming in hot, and then all of a sudden that energy just dropped. And then people would pivot and say, I have a lesbian daughter that I'm estranged from. What kind of advice do you have
Oh
for
my
me? How
gosh.
can I help connect with her? And those conversations were one after another. We had one guy yell at us for grooming children. And within like 10 minutes, he was apologizing, and we hugged it out, and we and we had these great conversations. And it wasn't that I expected to change anybody's mind in that moment,
Mhm.
but it was just, if someone can hear that you are respecting them, that you are listening to them, then it just shifts the energy, and then you can have real conversations with them.
Yeah.
And so maybe they'll walk away and they'll meet a gay employee or a neighbor or something, and their attitude might shift towards them, or maybe they'll become more curious about them, and then that dialogue will continue. And so I'm just a firm believer in this approach. It is difficult though, and it's exhausting, and I'm a big introvert, so it's like this is like a
Mm.
big, like, I'm exhausted after I have those interactions,
Mhm.
but I'm also like I find them so rewarding as well. And so we went back this year to the Republican convention as well, and had more intense conversations. And I just believe in showing up
Oh.
in all the spaces where we're not expected,
Mhm.
and reaching out my hand out, and saying, "Hey, what do we have in common? I
Mhm.
know we disagree about things, but what do you think we have in common?"
Mhm.
And yeah,
Well, the amazing thing is it works. And I do think like it really seems to be the only thing that does work if your goal is moving forward, if your goal is healing, if your goal is making like finding compromise. And in a democracy, I think
yeah.
I mean, that's
I
what
mean,
we're.
yeah, I think a lot about like what's our objective, what's our goal, what do we want to achieve, and what I desire, is a healthy American pluralism.
Mm.
And to me, that we have people who are there's always going to be conservatives, there's always going to be liberals and various variations within. There's always going to be gay and queer people and straight people and religious people and atheists, and somehow we all have to figure out how to get along.
Yep.
We all have to coexist. We've been able to do that for the most part, give or take a civil war here or there. But for the most part, as a nation, we've been able to sort of come together across differences. And when we see injustice, the beautiful thing about America is that we keep working to create that more perfect union, whether it was the abolition of slavery or the suffrage movement or the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the LGBT movement. We're always trying to make sure that the liberties and the blessings of this country are available to everybody. And when we see that people are excluded from it, we work to expand the circle to bring them in. That's America at our best. And I just have to believe that we can get there again. But I'm a big, when you get hired at Equality Utah, you get a couple books you have to read. One is Earshots, Don't Label Me. Another one is Arthur Brooks' Love
Mm.
Your Enemies. And Arthur talks, I mean, he wrote that book recently with Oprah, and he's more of a center right person, and which is important for my staff to read someone who's more right leaning. But it's a brilliant, beautiful book. And he talks a lot about how we've developed this kind of culture of contempt, that we see our opponents not just as opponents, but actually as evil,
Yeah.
as people who are trying to destroy the country. And what he makes clear is that the other side thinks of us the same way. And he talks about this concept. It's very academic. I think he called it motive attribution asymmetry. Motive attribution asymmetry, that in a conflict, whether it's within nation states or between couples, when we get into conflict, we believe that we are motivated by love and truth and righteousness,
Mm-hmm.
and the other side is motivated by hate and greed and spite. And so I really began to think about that. Like when I sit down with people, whether I'm sitting down with members of the leaders of the church or legislators or the governor, and I thought, what if I truly understood that they believed that they were motivated by love? How does that change how I engage with them?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very different. I may not agree with their position on something, but everyone believes that they're the hero in their narrative,
Mm-hmm.
right? Right. So everyone believes that what they're doing is, I had a lot of disagreements about, what the legislature thinks about transgender people, but I understand that they believe that they're doing something, that their position is the correct one and
Mm-hmm.
is the true one. And so I want to be curious about that. And if I can be curious about that and respect their fears or their concerns, maybe then they'll be open to hearing my point of view
Yep.
and then perhaps considering another way to see something. And that's my hope is to be able to shift the certainty to which someone holds on to a position,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just to spark a little bit of like doubt and curiosity on their end, which requires that I can't always be locked into certainty on my end.
Yep. Yep.
I have to be open to maybe revising my point of view if I can get different data and, not to be sort of blown by every wind of doctrine, but to actually just be open to the thought that maybe my opponent might have something that I need to learn as well.
Yep.
What a radical, crazy idea.
What totally it is, and it's totally counter to human nature. But that's the way I want to live too, because the other way of living is too limiting, even just intellectually, right? To think that I
Yeah,
already have all the answers and to not have
right.
intellectual humility means that I'm going to be limited in my potential to
Exactly.
gain wisdom in life, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's often said, like liberals have the truth that conservatives are missing, and
Mm-hmm.
conservatives have some truths that liberals are missing, and
Mm-hmm.
together we become whole. And I like to think about that, like there is this kind of idea that progressives are always pushing on the gas pedal and conservatives are hitting the brakes about progress, and
Mm-hmm.
there are like mutations of it, right? I mean, there is fascism, right? There is extremism,
Sure.
and there's extremism on all sides, and those mutations need to be taken seriously and not discarded. And if someone is in fact very violent towards LGBT people, I'm not going to encourage my staff to go in and meet with the Proud Boys, or et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
If but I want to be careful and not just assume that lump everybody
Right.
into that. Everybody who disagrees with me is a fascist.
Right.
That's not true. Everyone who disagrees with me is a bigot or a racist. That's not true. I have to be willing to ask myself and interrogate my own beliefs and my own thinking. So
Yeah. All right. Well, to wrap up, I have two quick questions for you that I want to make sure that we hit before we end the conversation. One is, what do you see as one of the biggest challenges facing the queer community right now? And then
yeah,
the second question is going to be, what can straight allies do to be most helpful as the queer community is facing that
excellent.
challenge?
Gotcha. Good. Well, I think we've talked a lot about the progress that we're making. And with that progress, there has been a significant backlash with hundreds of anti LGBT bills being introduced all across the country. And sadly, it is transgender people who are bearing the brunt of these bills. They're being scapegoated in a pretty aggressive manner. And when I see the hysteria that is generated around transgender people, I think of the French philosopher. Do you know like Rene Girard at all? Have you
Mm-mm,
of him?
no.
Yeah, so Rene Girard talks about this idea of scapegoating, which is the kind of psychosocial mechanism that projects the anxiety of a society onto an individual,
Mm,
or in this case, a group of people, and sanctions a form of communal violence or legislative violence to expel them from the society or from the town square, etc. And and so we are seeing this kind of moral panic around transgender people who are just trying to live their lives and trying to, achieve their own, hopes and dreams, and to be the source of so much focus from the legislature, and with such cruelty, is has been really difficult to for us to see and to actually um, respond to, because it's often irrational
mhm,
fears, and that's very challenging. And I would so I worry about that tremendously, and we're working on ways again to sort of try to figure out how to deactivate the amygdala for people who are fearful of transgender people,
mm,
and help to make some kind of just hopefully we can sort of encourage people to approach this very complicated issue with compassion, respecting the dignity and the rights of this community.
mm,
Um, and then what can allies do? Well, I'm a huge proponent of allyship. We can't do this work without you. Sometimes I will hear people say, I don't need allies, we're going to do it on our own. And I completely reject that. I think it's all rubbish. And we need allies at our side. I need you, Amy, at my side doing this work alongside of me. I don't want to do
mhm,
it alone because it's lonely. I want you to be at the party. And and I want us all to remember, like we said earlier, that symbol of the civil rights movement is the black hand and the white hand clasped together. And I want to bring that back on all contexts. And I think that the core of this issue, the core of allyship, truly is friendship, and a willingness to bear one another's burdens, to be there when someone is in distress, and to listen when our hearts are breaking because of a piece of legislation or something that's happened. And then finally, just show up, come to our events, our parades, our festivals, and our galas, and enjoy the celebration. All right. Because we want you to march with us. And also, importantly, we want you to dance with us when we are celebrating, because we need your anger in the face of injustice, but we also need your laughter to celebrate everything that's beautiful. We have to have both. And I don't want to do it alone. I can't do it alone. So, Amy, I just need you by my side.
Here I
and,
am.
and that's what allyship is, is
Yeah.
being together through difficult times,
Mm.
and
Oh, I
and then
love it.
and also joyful times, right?
Yeah.
Both.
That's wonderful. Wonderful,
So
wonderful. Well, that reminds me of, I mean, what I'd love to leave listeners with is ways that we can show up and do work for people who are in Utah. I know there are some Utah specific organizations that I'd love you to talk about or at least
yeah,
mention. And then you have an essay in a new book called The Book of Queer Mormon Joy, right? Speaking of joy, can you
right.
talk about some of these?
Yeah, Signature Books has a new anthology out about short stories. It's full of several short stories. Some of our mutual friends, Stacey Harkey has a story in it. Eli McCann has a foreword by Carolyn Pearson, and I have this really zany, tragic, funny story about my mom's funeral and how Elvis showed up for my mom's funeral. And but it's also, you'll see the kind of the seeds of all these conversations in that story. And it's about my
Mm,
own sort of learning to accept my parents for who they were, as I'm asking for their acceptance about who I am.
mm.
And so that's an important kind of journey. So that story is told in the Book of Queer Mormon Joy. It's out now, from Signature Books. So yeah, and then in terms of local organizations, if you want to get involved and help, when does this podcast air? When?
Sometime during June, like in the
Okay,
next few
all right,
weeks.
Great. Okay. So yeah, you can go to equalityutah.org and you can see all of our programs. We have a big giant gala October 5th at the Eccles Theater in downtown Salt Lake City, which is a big giant spectacle. And it's called the Allies Gala because we want allies to be there. And then also there's other great organizations in Utah that we work closely with. I love the Encircle houses and the work that they're doing to elevate LGBT youth. There is the UAF Legacy Clinic. It's the Utah AIDS Foundation Legacy Clinic, which is a clinic that helps complete healthcare for LGBT people in the state. And they're they truly are one of the great legacy organizations in Utah. And yeah, and then we just, encourage you just to, come and join all of our, there's always some queer thing going on. There's always, every little town has a pride festival now. Even Short Creek, I did my TV show in Short Creek for TLC, the former FLDS headquarter town. They have their own pride celebration in Colorado City. So you can go march with them during their parades as well. So there's
Amazing.
stuff happening all over the state, and we would love you to be part of the celebration.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Troy, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you for all the work that you've done. You are an inspiration to me, and thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.